Hey, everybody, welcome to Reason and Theology. I'm your host, Michael. As promised, I want to begin to do some videos engaging Buddhism and also eventually Hinduism. But first, I'm going to start with Buddhism. This is going to be a relatively short one. I'm not going to do any deep dives just yet, but I wanted to start with something that is a fundamental difference between Buddhism and Christianity. I do think that there is some overlap between Christianity and Buddhism on some points, especially in the area of morality. But I think that there are some key differences. And one of those is how we understand God. In fact, we could say that Buddhism really doesn't necessarily believe that there is a almighty, powerful creator God. And so that is what we are going to consider today. Is there a key difference in our understanding of God? Does Buddhism even believe in God? In order to do this, I want to review a clip here by Doug's Dharma, and he explains to us whether or not Buddhism is atheistic at its core. And then I'm going to compare that to Christianity and also explain maybe some of the difficulties I have with the Buddhist position as a Christian.
So here the Buddha substitutes a very down-to-earth kind of this life practice for the more speculative kind of union with a supernatural being. In a different sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha talks about the notion of a creator God as being very problematic,
and now this is incredibly crucial to Christians because we do believe that there is one God and he is all powerful and is the creator of all things, both visible and invisible. So this is going to touch on Christianity,
leading to a kind of fatalistic notion. Because if God created the world and is responsible at all times for sustaining the world, then God is responsible for our actions, both good and bad. God is responsible for murders, God is responsible for theft and for lying and so on. And God is responsible for our wrong beliefs, our ignorance and so on.
See, I would say it's not that simple. I don't think that somehow the creator God necessitates a denial of free will. But that's a different discussion. I think the more fundamental question is there in fact good evidence that there is an all-powerful creator God? If there is, then we need to deal with issues like, well, how does that work with autonomy? How does that work with free will? I don't think we need to use the question of, well, we have this difficulty with free will that we do have answers for, but there's this difficulty, therefore, that shows that we should not believe in a creator God. I think it's the other way around. Is there good evidence that there is a creator God who is all powerful, that there is only one God, and then we can deal with any difficulties that follow from that? And that is what we're going to examine here in a moment. But I want to finish the rest of the clip before I dive in.
This leads, in the Buddha's estimation, to a kind of a philosophy of non-action or non-doing, because it seems like there's nothing we can do. If God's responsible for all, then God's responsible for all that's both bad and good.
And I would say in response to that, if there are good reasons that we can believe there is an all-powerful creator God, then these other difficulties should not, again, be used to overturn this concept. Moreover, I want to say, look, I think that there are good reasons that can explain how it is that you can have this omniscient, all-powerful God, and yet we remain autonomous to an extent, at the very least, that we actually have free will. How is it that God is not accountable for our sins? How is it that God is not accountable for evil in the world? I think that there are reasonable answers here. And I've noticed in one interview, in fact, with the Dalai Lama, he mentions that, in areas where we can show by reason that Buddha was wrong, well, we can actually disagree with him. And I would say, okay, I think this is one such instance. I don't think that this is a knockout argument against theism. Rather, I do think it's a difficulty that has reasonable answers. And since there are reasonable answers, I want to say, well, I think that this is an argument we can dismiss. Now, what are those reasonable answers? That's a fair question. And perhaps we will explore that in more detail. What I will do on the question of free will versus God's sovereignty, I will refer you on that specific question to other videos where I've already interviewed multiple experts who are Christian who have offered some good solutions on this. I'll refer you to those videos at the moment. The more principal question that I want to consider is, in fact, is there evidence for a creator God? That's what we're going to focus on today.
In the Western tradition, this is known as the argument from evil. It's the argument that such a God as this can't exist because God is supposed to be all good, as well as all powerful and all knowing. But for the Buddha sort of describes this kind of view as being unhelpful because it leads us to a feeling of uselessness, of fatalism.
Couldn't we in turn say that this other opposite view, that there is no creator God, is unhelpful because it leads us to a position where we think we can do whatever we want without any consequences and accountability from a supreme being? See, if it's fair for the Buddha to criticize us on grounds that, hey, this may lead to this difficulty, well, can we not do the same with those who would deny that there is an all-powerful creator God? It seems what is good for the goose is good for the gander.
And so, in that sense, the Buddha believes that the notion of this kind of creator God, this all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God, is just not useful to our daily practice.
I think it's incredibly useful to our daily practice. If there is an all good, all knowing, all loving, all powerful creator God, that's incredibly useful to my daily practice because such a God would have revealed himself and told us what he expects from us. And in fact, that is exactly what we claim in the Christian religion. And there's very, very good evidence that God has done just such a thing. But we're going to start with the most fundamental questions. Is there a creator God?
Nevertheless, one of the Buddha's most common descriptions in the texts is as a teacher of gods and humans. And why is that? That's because very, very often in the texts, the Buddha is described as teaching gods. That the Buddha will have gods as his pupils, as almost as much, not quite, not as much, but very often. So it's almost as much as the people, as much as his own monastic followers.
And this is a really interesting point, and is also something that I encountered as soon as I began to look into Buddhism in order to see how does it compare and contrast with Christianity. One of the first things that I studied was the moment where Buddha is said to have reached enlightenment. And in that event, he is tempted by the god Mara. And I thought, well, this is interesting. I thought that Buddhism was supposed to be atheistic at its core, and yet we have here references to gods. And in fact, it's not just Mara who's mentioned. You also have Brahma and many others who are mentioned, who are, by the way, Hindu gods. Now, of course, we know Buddhism came out of a Hindu context, so it makes sense that they have these references. But how do we reconcile this, or how at least do Buddhists reconcile this concept that there is effectively no all-powerful creator God, and yet you have references to gods all over the place in Buddhism in these early texts? That's what Doug is going to get into here in just a second, and I actually found his answer to be quite helpful.
So what are we to make of this kind of apparent contradiction, where on the one hand he's criticizing the notion of gods, but on the other hand he's apparently teaching gods, and so these gods must exist in his world as he sees it? And the answer, I think, is quite simple, that the Buddha was an atheist about an everlasting or all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good kind of God. He was an atheist about a God that was perfect, that was unchanging, the kind of God, frankly, of Western theology. Indeed, belief in this kind of a God is one of the wrong views listed in the Brahmajala Sutta, which is a very famous sutta at the beginning of the Digha Nikaya that lists a bunch of wrong views. But the Buddha did not disbelieve in supernatural beings generally. Indeed, belief in supernatural beings is pretty common. Basically, it's universal in a pre-modern world. They believe that there were these kinds of supernatural beings around, but in the Buddha's picture, they were not all-powerful, not all-knowing, and not all good. And neither were they eternally existing or everlasting.
In other words, they weren't really gods. Not in the Christian sense or even the Western sense in which we use the term, which generally refers to, again, an all-powerful, all-knowing God.
They lived and died. They were born, they lived for a time, and then they died. And so they were basically like superhumans. rather than gods. Also in later Buddhism, particularly in elements of the Mahayana form of Buddhism, we get what's called Buddha nature, a belief in Buddha nature.
Notice now that he's referring to various kinds of Buddhists. In fact, there are plenty, there's a great variety of Buddhists. Now he's speaking about a very particular tradition, and he's going to show how there are some concepts that start to seem theistic in nature for some groups of Buddhists.
And this is something that begins to approach a kind of theology where there's the idea that although the Buddha himself has passed away, nevertheless, there is a kind of Buddha nature, dharmic nature of the Buddha that underlies all of reality, and that in some sense is responsible for certain aspects of reality, and that can be petitioned or prayed to in a sense, asked to do things. And so in later Buddhism, there grows up a kind of devotional Buddhism, religious Buddhism, oriented around this kind of Buddha nature.
Very good. So I think that that is a good explanation, again, from Doug's Dharma on the tension in Buddhism. Well, it seems to be atheistic, but then they speak about gods. How does that work? But also, what exactly is it that Buddhists believe? Is there a version of an all powerful, all creator God? The answer is no. However, you do start to see some themes of a God that is a little bit more than the gods that we've mentioned previously in certain strands of Buddhism, but certainly nothing that would actually reach the Western concept of divinity. Now, is there good reason for the Western concept of divinity? Or specifically, is there good reason for the notion that there is one God in the Christian tradition that is all powerful, all good, things along those lines? I would certainly refer people to the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who in his Summa Theologica considers all of these questions. Is there one God? Are there many gods? Is God truthful? Is he good or is he evil? All kinds of considerations. But let's start with the very, very, very basics. Is there just evidence that there is this one God who is all powerful? I want to consider a very quick condensed version of what's called Aquinas's 5 proofs or 5 ways for God that I'm going to share on my screen that I think are some good arguments that St. Thomas Aquinas offers for the fact that there is a divinity such as the one that we believe in the Western tradition, specifically Christianity. And he's going to give some proofs for these based on reason alone. He's not going to appeal to sacred scripture. He's going to appeal just straight to reason. And so if we can show by reason that there is this one God, then I would say that, okay, any difficulties that arise from that afterwards, we need to deal with them as such. Difficulties that arise after we've already established this concept of a one creator God. We don't need to allow those difficulties somehow to dismiss any good evidence for this God. So let's do that very briefly here. The very first argument or first way is what's called the argument from motion. It says, our senses can perceive motion by seeing that things act on one another. Whatever moves is moved by something else. Consequently, there must be a first mover that creates this chain reaction of motions. This is God. God sets all things in motion and gives them their potential. Now, some people have a problem with this argument from motion. They think that, well, it's outdated scientifically. Not exactly if you understand the context of Aquinas on this matter, but for those who say, I don't know, it just doesn't sound really helpful. There's plenty others to consider. Consider this one. The argument from efficient cause is the second way or second proof. This is summarized as follows. Because nothing can cause itself, everything must have a cause or something that creates an effect on another thing. Without a first cause, there would be no others. Therefore, the first cause is God. And a good point to mention here is he's not assuming that the world was created. He's not even assuming a non eternal universe. In fact, in his proofs, he's able to assume an eternal universe and still argue for God. Here's another one, the argument from necessary being. Because objects in the world come into existence and pass out of it, it is possible for those objects to exist or not exist at any particular time. However, nothing can come from nothing. This means something must exist at all times. This is God. And again, in this argument, he can even still assume an eternal universe and still prove that there is a God by this argument from a necessary being. There's a few others. The argument from gradation. There are different degrees of goodness in different things following the great chain of being, which states there is a gradual increase in complexity. Created objects move from unformed inorganic matter to biologically complex organisms. Therefore, there must be a being of the highest form of good. This perfect being is God. And then lastly, there's another proof that he offers here, the argument from design. All things have an order of arrangement that leads them to a particular goal. Because the order of the universe cannot be the result of chance, design and purpose must be at work. This implies divine intelligence on the part of the designer. This is what we call God. Now you can see this here. The citation is Aquinas' 5 Proofs for the Existence of God in the Catholic Faith Handbook for Youth Teacher Guide by St. Mary's Press. This is again just a synopsis of it. I'll include a more detailed description. Well, not actually description. I'll just refer you straight to the Summa Theologica, where you can go and to read a more detailed treatise on each one of these by Aquinas himself. And they are very, very, very strong arguments for the fact that there is this one God. And again, he gives many proofs that, okay, it is one God, not multiple gods. It is a God who is truthful, not a liar. It is God who is good, not evil. It is God who is omnipresent. It is a God who is omniscient. It is a God who is all powerful. It is a God who is the creator God. He goes into many, many different proofs from reason alone to demonstrate these things. And I think that those sufficiently establish the Christian deity. And thus, once that is established, we can then get into questions on, well, how does that work with our autonomy and free will, which once again, I refer you to several of the videos that I have in the description of this video, the show notes. Definitely take a look at those, where we dive into the question of evil in the world. The Odyssey is what it's called. How does that work with the Christian tradition of an all good, all loving, and all knowing God? Well, I hope you enjoy this. If you want to see more of these, make sure to hit that like button and the subscribe button if you haven't already, and be sure to leave a comment there in the comment section. Let me know what you think. All right, see you later. God bless. Oh, wait, before you go, I would really appreciate it if you would consider supporting this channel. This is my primary means to provide for my family, and it also helps me to produce content like this video. If you would like to support me, become a patron by visiting patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll also get access to extra exclusive content when you become a patron. Lastly, hit that like button and the subscribe button, and be sure to leave a comment down below. God bless.